The winter air hung heavy with the damp chill of Wales in January 1457. Within the thick stone walls of Pembroke Castle, the corridors echoed with hurried footsteps, the whispers of servants and the sharp clatter of iron keys. Torches sputtered against the dampness, their flames struggling to illuminate the drafty passageways. Behind a barred chamber door, the cries of a girl barely into her teens cut through the night. Margaret Beaufort, only 13 years old, lay on a straw-stuffed mattress, her body racked with waves of agony. The bed was piled high with blankets, yet she shivered uncontrollably. Her small frame was not ready for childbirth, and the midwives knew it. Their worried glances darted between one another as they worked, mixing herbs, boiling water, whispering prayers under their breath. The young bride had been married scarcely a year before her husband, Edmund Tudor, died of plague while imprisoned by Yorkist soldiers. She was left widowed, alone, and pregnant. Now, she bore not only the burden of survival but the hope of a lineage. The child she struggled to bring forth was no ordinary babe. His blood carried the claims of Lancaster and the shadow of royal ambition. But all that meant little in the moment, for the girl mother teetered on the edge of death. Her screams rose, raw and piercing, echoing off the vaulted ceiling. One midwife held her hand, whispering comfort. Another ground dried rue leaves into a bitter drink meant to steady her wound. A third crossed herself repeatedly, muttering pleas to the Virgin Mary. Margaret's hair, damp with sweat, clung to her face as she gasped for breath. The labor dragged on. Hours passed in a blur of agony and whispered prayers. Her body, narrow-hipped and frail, resisted the ordeal. At one point she slipped into a daze, her eyes rolling back, her lips murmuring a psalm she had memorized in childhood. The women feared she would not survive. In hushed tones, they prepared for the worst, setting aside cloths for a death shroud even as they coaxed her back into consciousness. At last, as dawn threatened the horizon, a shrill cry split the chamber, not Margaret's but that of her child. The midwives lifted a small, bloody form into the air, and the wails of an infant filled the room. "A son," one whispered, her voice hoarse with exhaustion. "You have a son, my lady?" Margaret collapsed back into the bed, tears streaking her cheeks. Relief mingled with the dull ache of her battered body. The boy, small but alive, was swaddled in linen and placed in her arms. She gazed at him with a mixture of wonder and disbelief. The child she had risked her life to deliver would one day be known as Henry Tudor. Henry VII, the first monarch of the Tudor dynasty. But that destiny was far away. In the stillness after the storm, the chamber was filled with a heavy silence. The midwives exchanged wary glances. Margaret's injuries were severe, and whispers spread that she might never bear another child. Her pelvis, so narrow, had nearly cost her life. She lay pale and trembling, her lips pressed to her newborn's brow, already marked by sacrifice. Outside, the castle walls stood silent against the gray Welsh sky, unaware of the history unfolding within. No trumpets blared, no chronicler wrote of the event that morning. Yet the kingdom's future had shifted in that single night of blood and cries. For Margaret, the ordeal was seared into her soul. The memory of her torn body and the agony of that birth never left her. It forged in her a sense of divine purpose, a belief that her suffering had meaning. She clung fiercely to faith, praying daily, fasting, and dedicating herself to a life of piety. But beneath the prayers burned a will of iron. The girl who had survived her first childbirth at 13 would never forget the price of life in a world ruled by men and ambition. She would use her survival as a weapon, her son as a beacon, and her faith as her armor. The dynasty of the Tudors was born not in triumph, but in blood, screams, and the unbreakable will of a child mother who refused to die. Long before Margaret Beaufort first drew breath, her destiny was already entangled in the turbulent web of England's monarchy. She was born in 1443, the only child of John Beaufort, Duke of Somerset, and Margaret Beauchamp. Her bloodline was a tapestry woven with threads of both greatness and scandal, a heritage that placed her on the knife's edge between power and peril. The Beauforts traced their descent to John of Gaunt, the mighty Duke of Lancaster, son of King Edward III. John of Gaunt's influence had stretched across Europe, his banners carried from Spain to Scotland, his ambition rivaled only by kings themselves. Yet the Beauforts were no ordinary branch of the royal tree. They were born of John's union with his mistress, Catherine Swynford, later legitimized when Gaunt finally married her. A papal bull and an act of parliament declared the Beaufort children legitimate, fit to inherit land and titles. But in the shadowy margins of the document lay a single devastating exception. They were barred from the royal succession. That one clause, perhaps intended to quiet whispers at court, would haunt Margaret's life and that of her unborn son. For what is denied in writing often tempts fate all the more fiercely. Her father, John Beaufort, seemed destined for greatness. He was entrusted with military command in France during the dying years of the 100 Years' War. Yet his campaign ended in disaster. Defeat piled upon defeat, and whispers of cowardice and betrayal clung to his name. When he returned to England, his honor in ruins, the weight of disgrace consumed him. In 1444, when Margaret was only a year old, John Beaufort died. Some said illness, others claimed despair drove him to suicide. Chroniclers hinted at poison, mutiny, even divine punishment for the sins of his line. Whatever the truth, his death left his infant daughter sole heiress to vast estates, and utterly vulnerable. For a girl in 15th century England, wealth was both shield and snare. Margaret inherited not only lands but the ambitions of others. She was a prize to be bartered, her hand a lever of power in the ceaseless struggle between Lancaster and York. Even in her nursery she was never her own. Her mother, Margaret Beaufort, remarried quickly, seeking stability in a world of shifting allegiances. Yet it was the crown itself that soon laid claim to young Margaret's fate. King Henry VI, weak in body and mind, relied heavily on advisors eager to consolidate power. They saw in the Beaufort heiress a pawn of immense value, one who could be bound to allies through marriage. By the time she was 6 years old, Margaret was promised to John de la Pole, son of the Duke of Suffolk. It was a union designed not for love, nor even companionship, but for political expediency. For a child who still clutched dolls and learned her letters, the contract was a reminder of the ruthless stage upon which her life was set. But fortune shifted swiftly. William de la Pole, Duke of Suffolk and architect of the match, fell from royal favor. Accused of treason, he was arrested, exiled, and brutally murdered at sea in 1450. His body, hacked apart by sailors, washed ashore as a symbol of the chaos consuming England. With his downfall, the betrothal was annulled. Thus Margaret, scarcely more than a child, was once again unbound, a precious piece yet to be played in the deadly game of dynastic chess. It was in this turbulent world that her path crossed with the rising Tudor family, a house of Welsh gentry whose fortunes had been transformed by scandalous romance. Owen Tudor, a servant of humble birth, had captured the heart of Catherine of Valois, the widowed queen of Henry V. Their secret marriage produced sons who, though half Welsh and born outside traditional nobility, were half-brothers to King Henry VI himself. From this unlikely union sprang Edmund and Jasper Tudor, men raised to prominence by royal favor. Edmund, ambitious and eager to secure his house, cast his eye upon Margaret Beaufort. She was 10 years old, he was in his mid-20s. To him she was not a child but the key to wealth, power, and legitimacy. Thus began the shaping of Margaret's destiny, not by her will but by the convergence of bloodlines, ambition, and the ever-shifting balance of power. The Beaufort legacy was a double-edged sword, noble enough to inspire hope, tainted enough to breed suspicion. To the powerful, Margaret was a vessel, her womb a battlefield where claims to the throne might be born. To Margaret herself, though still too young to understand, her inheritance was a burden that would demand every ounce of courage she possessed. The girl who played in the courtyards of Bletsoe Castle, unaware of the full measure of her lineage, was already marked by history. The sins of her ancestors, the ambition of kings, and the ambitions of men like Edmund Tudor would shape her fate. She was heir to a legacy at once glorious and cursed, a legacy that would culminate in a dynasty forged in blood. The year was 1455, and England stood on the brink of collapse. Whispers of treason rippled through the corridors of Westminster, noble houses sharpened their swords, and the fragile reign of Henry VI teetered like a candle in the wind. War, the bloody conflict that would come to be known as the Wars of the Roses, was about to erupt. In the midst of this turmoil, a young girl's fate was sealed. Margaret Beaufort, barely 12 years old, was summoned to court. She was no ordinary child. Her inheritance made her one of the wealthiest heiresses in the kingdom. For men in power, she was both prize and pawn. It was here that Edmund Tudor laid claim to her hand. The match was arranged swiftly, sanctioned by King Henry VI himself. For Edmund, it was a triumph, a chance to cement his family's position among the realm's great houses. For Margaret, it was the end of her childhood. The marriage took place at Bletsoe Castle. Accounts say she appeared solemn, her small frame swallowed by silks and heavy jewels, her hands trembling as vows were spoken. Edmund, 26 years old, towered over her. The union was not one of choice nor affection, but of ambition and necessity. Margaret, still in the care of her mother only months before, now belonged to a man twice her age. Marriage for a girl so young carried dangers. Even among nobles, it was rare for consummation to occur before a bride reached her mid-teens. But Edmund Tudor was impatient. He pressed his claim not only to her lands but to her body. Within months, Margaret found herself with child. The toll was immense. Her body was slight, unready for the burden of pregnancy. She moved slowly through the halls of Pembroke Castle, her hands resting protectively over her belly, her steps careful, her eyes downcast. The household whispered prayers for her survival, for it was well known that girls so young often perished in childbirth. Yet Edmund seemed unmoved by her fragility. His ambition was fixed on the promise of an heir. Beyond the castle walls, England burned. The first clash of the Wars of the Roses erupted at St. Albans in May 1455. Richard, Duke of York, struck at the forces of Lancaster, and the king himself was captured in battle. Noble blood ran in the streets, and the realm was divided into bitter factions. Margaret's life, fragile though it was, became bound to the survival of Lancaster. Then came a cruel twist of fate. In 1456, as the war spread, Edmund Tudor was captured by Yorkist forces. Imprisoned at Carmarthen Castle, he succumbed to disease. Some said plague, others dysentery. He was 36 years old. Margaret was 13. Widowed, pregnant, alone. The news of Edmund's death fell on her like a crushing blow. In the dim chambers of Pembroke, she wept, her small hands clutching her swollen belly, her future uncertain. She had no husband to shield her, no father to guide her, only the weight of her unborn child and the knowledge that both her life and his were at risk. It was under these grim circumstances that she endured the ordeal of childbirth, the night of screams, blood, and whispered prayers that brought Henry Tudor into the world. The girl who had entered marriage as a child now stood as a widow and a mother, scarred by loss and marked by survival. Her husband's death left her vulnerable, yet it also set her free from his ambition. In his place, she now held something far more dangerous, a son whose bloodline could change the kingdom's fate. As Margaret lay in her chamber, weak and broken from the ordeal, she gazed at the tiny infant swaddled beside her. She could not have known then that the boy, frail, his cries thin as reed song, would one day be crowned King of England. But perhaps, deep within her bruised heart, she sensed it. Perhaps she felt, as she so often would in years to come, that God had chosen her for a purpose. For now, she was a widow of 13, a mother before her time, and a living testament to the cruelty of dynastic ambition. The roses of Lancaster and York would continue to bleed the kingdom dry, but within the battered stone walls of Pembroke Castle, a new seed had been planted, one that, in time, would grow into the Tudor dynasty. Margaret Beaufort entered widowhood at 13. The halls of Pembroke Castle echoed with silence in those days, broken only by the cries of her infant son. Where once the banners of Edmund Tudor had flown proudly, now there hung only the shadows of defeat and loss. Yet Margaret did not collapse beneath grief. Though her body was frail, her will began to harden. In the fragile face of her son, Henry, she saw both her greatest burden and her singular purpose. All else, her comfort, her safety, even her happiness, would be sacrificed to protect him. But Margaret was not mistress of her own destiny. The law saw her as a ward, her estates held in trust until the crown decided otherwise. The custody of her lands, and of young Henry, passed into the hands of powerful men. It was Jasper Tudor, Edmund's brother, who took them both under his wing. Jasper was no ordinary guardian. Fiercely loyal to Lancaster, he was one of the few men left who could offer Margaret protection in a kingdom unraveling at its seams. He fortified Pembroke Castle, raising troops and storing supplies, making it a bastion of resistance against the advancing Yorkists. To Margaret, Jasper became both shield and ally, though whispers at court suggested their closeness might be something more. If such rumors were true, neither ever confirmed them. What mattered was survival. As civil war deepened, Margaret's position became ever more precarious. Henry VI's fragile rule faltered, his mental breakdowns leaving the kingdom effectively leaderless. Queen Margaret of Anjou, fierce and unyielding, fought to defend her husband's crown. The Duke of York, ambitious and calculating, pressed his claim as protector of the realm. Battles flared from St. Albans to Towton, fields drenched in blood as brother fought brother. Margaret watched all this with a clarity beyond her years. She understood that the throne was no longer secure, that kings could fall as swiftly as dukes. She also knew that her son's future, and perhaps her own, would depend on the side she chose. But at 15 she faced yet another cruel twist of fate, remarriage. For noble widows, choice was a luxury rarely afforded. The crown saw in her a valuable piece of property, and like property, she was transferred to a new husband. This time it was Sir Henry Stafford, son of the Duke of Buckingham. The match brought her into one of the most powerful Yorkist-leaning families in England, a union designed to temper Lancaster's reach. The marriage was less brutal than her first. Stafford was closer to her in age, gentler in disposition, and more cautious in politics. With him, Margaret found a measure of stability, though not affection in the romantic sense. Together they navigated a kingdom torn apart, aligning carefully with whichever faction seemed ascendant, while quietly safeguarding young Henry's claim. Yet the storms of war could not be avoided. In 1461, after the Yorkist triumph at Towton, Henry VI was driven into exile, and Edward IV ascended the throne. Lancaster's power crumbled, and with it Jasper Tudor's influence waned. Margaret's son, only 4 years old, was stripped from her care. The boy, who had barely known his mother, was sent into the custody of William Herbert, a staunch Yorkist, who intended to raise him as a loyal subject of Edward IV. The separation tore at Margaret's heart. In the quiet of her chambers, she wept bitterly, clutching the small clothes Henry had once worn, whispering prayers for his safety. Yet even in sorrow, her resolve deepened. If she could not hold her son, she would fight for him with every tool at her disposal. This was the crucible in which Margaret's political instincts were forged. She learned to mask her feelings, to smile in the company of those she despised, to bow when her heart urged her to defy. She became adept at reading men's ambitions, at bending without breaking, at keeping her true loyalties hidden beneath a veil of piety and obedience. Faith, too, became her armor. In prayer she found solace but also strategy. She cultivated a reputation for holiness, retreating into chapels, fasting, commissioning religious works. To some, she appeared merely a devout widow. To those with sharper eyes, her devotion was a shield, a way to deflect suspicion, to cloak her political maneuvers in the garb of righteousness. Margaret Beaufort was no longer the frightened child who had entered marriage at 12. She was becoming something far more dangerous. A woman who understood that survival required patience, that influence could be wielded softly as well as with steel, and that destiny favored those who endured. Her son was growing, far from her embrace but never far from her thoughts. To the Yorkist king he was a pawn, a boy to be molded. To Margaret he was everything, heir to the Beaufort legacy, the fragile thread upon which her life's purpose hung. And though the crown of England seemed securely planted on the head of Edward IV, Margaret Beaufort was already looking to the future. She had seen kings fall before. She knew they could fall again. The child bride had become a strategist. The widow had become a survivor. And the mother, though separated from her son, had become the architect of his destiny. The 1460s and 1470s were years of upheaval, a ceaseless whirl of battles, betrayals, and shifting fortunes. For Margaret Beaufort, they were also years of endurance. Though outwardly subdued, cloaked in her reputation as a pious noblewoman, inwardly she schemed and calculated, every thought circling back to the same fragile hope, the destiny of her son, Henry Tudor. Young Henry, her only child, had been taken from her arms when he was just 4. In the care of William Herbert, the Yorkist noble who raised him at Raglan Castle, Henry grew up under watchful eyes that sought to strip him of Lancaster's blood and mold him into a loyal servant of King Edward IV. Margaret was permitted only rare glimpses of him, if any at all. Each separation was agony, but she swallowed her grief. To rage would bring ruin, to endure was to live to fight another day. Meanwhile, her second husband, Henry Stafford, chose the path of cautious loyalty to the Yorkist regime. It was a pragmatic choice, and Margaret played the dutiful wife, keeping her head bowed while her heart clung to Lancaster. Together they weathered the tides of war, battles at Edgecote, Barnet, and Tewkesbury, each one tightening Edward IV's grip on the throne. But Lancaster was not yet finished. Queen Margaret of Anjou returned from France, rallying support. The last desperate clash came at Tewkesbury in 1471, where her hopes were dashed, her son, Prince Edward, slain on the battlefield. Henry VI, feeble and broken, was murdered in the Tower shortly after. The House of Lancaster seemed utterly destroyed. And yet, one small boy, Margaret's son, still lived. It was in those moments of despair for Lancaster that Margaret's resolve hardened into iron. She knew the Yorkists would one day turn their eyes upon Henry, that his bloodline would mark him for death. If her son was to survive, he must vanish from their reach. And so he did. In 1471, with the aid of his uncle Jasper Tudor, young Henry fled into exile in Brittany, across the narrow sea. He would not return for 14 years. The separation nearly broke Margaret, Yet she bore it as she bore all things, with silent determination. Her son was safer far from England's treacherous court, beyond the grasp of Edward IV's agents. Though she could not hold him, she could fight for him from afar. And so Margaret Beaufort became a conspirator. Her household, her letters, her prayers, all became tools of subtle rebellion. She cultivated friendships among the disaffected, whispered promises to Lancastrian loyalists, and waited patiently for York to stumble. Yet she was no reckless plotter. Margaret's brilliance lay in her ability to cloak ambition in piety. She fasted, she founded chapels, she spoke always of God's will. To those who watched her closely, she seemed merely a devout widow. But beneath the veil of sanctity, she was planting seeds of rebellion. Then in 1471 tragedy struck once more. Her second husband, Henry Stafford, died of wounds sustained in battle. Margaret, still only 28, was widowed again. But with loss came new opportunity. Unbound, she was free to seek a union that would serve her greater purpose. She found it in Thomas Stanley. Stanley was no knightly hero. He was a consummate survivor, a man who shifted loyalties as deftly as the wind shifts direction. He was powerful, well-connected, and above all pragmatic. To Margaret he offered protection and influence at court. To Stanley she offered wealth and a connection to a royal claim. Their marriage, struck in 1472, was a pact of calculation, not affection. Yet it would prove one of the most consequential alliances in English history. Together, they navigated the uneasy peace of Edward IV's reign. Margaret played the loyal subject, even currying favor with Elizabeth Woodville, the Queen Consort. In public, she appeared submissive, even grateful for the Yorkist king's mercy. In private, her thoughts never wavered from Henry, now a teenager in exile. Her strategies grew bolder in the 1480s. She quietly maintained correspondence with Brittany, ensuring Henry was provisioned and supported. She gauged discontent among Yorkist nobles, noting which lords grumbled at Edward IV's heavy hand. When Edward died suddenly in 1483, leaving the throne to his 12-year-old son Edward V, Margaret recognized the fracture she had been waiting for. The kingdom was ripe for chaos. The boy king and his brother were lodged in the Tower of London under the protection, or imprisonment, of their uncle Richard, Duke of Gloucester. Within months, Richard declared the princes illegitimate, seized the throne for himself, and was crowned Richard III. To many it was an outrage. To Margaret it was opportunity. Richard's usurpation shocked the realm, turning former Yorkist loyalists into bitter enemies. Nobles who once spurned Lancaster now sought an alternative to the crown-snatching king. Margaret saw her chance. She began weaving together a coalition of discontent. Yorkists who despised Richard, Lancastrians who longed for restoration, and neutrals who desired stability. At the heart of her plan was a daring gambit, to unite her exiled son with Elizabeth of York, eldest daughter of Edward IV. By marrying York and Lancaster, Henry Tudor could present himself not merely as a Lancastrian claimant but as the bridge between two warring houses. It was audacious, almost impossible. Yet Margaret believed it was divinely ordained. And so, in secret, she brokered alliances. She whispered promises to the disaffected, secured oaths from rebels, and pledged her son's hand in marriage to Elizabeth. It was a dangerous game. Richard III was no fool. He kept a wary eye on Margaret, confining her movements, placing her under Stanley's watch. Yet even Richard underestimated her resolve. Stanley himself, though bound to the king by loyalty, quietly protected his wife's schemes. He too was waiting to see which way the wind would blow. By the winter of 1483, rebellion was stirring. The Duke of Buckingham, once Richard's ally, now turned against him, spurred on in part by Margaret's persuasion. Though the uprising failed, it signaled the beginning of the end for Richard's reign. Henry Tudor was no longer just a boy in exile. He was a claimant, a symbol, a hope for unity. And behind him, guiding his every step, was his mother, Margaret Beaufort. The child bride had endured the loss of innocence. The widow had endured the loss of love. The mother had endured the loss of her son. But through each trial, she had sharpened into something formidable. A strategist, a conspirator, and above all, the architect of a dynasty. The storm she had waited for was coming. And when it broke, England would never be the same. On that August day in 1485, as Henry Tudor claimed victory at Bosworth, Margaret Beaufort was transformed. Though she was not there in person, every soul at court knew she had been present in spirit, her hand guiding the course of destiny. When her son was crowned King Henry VII of England, Margaret became something England had never seen before, the mother of the reigning monarch, and she would wield that role with unprecedented authority. She styled herself not as Dowager Countess of Richmond, but with a title of her own creation, My Lady the King's Mother. It was more than vanity. The title declared her unique position. She was not a queen nor merely a dowager. She was the vessel of the dynasty, the woman through whom Henry's claim was justified, the root from which the Tudor rose had sprung. Her new life was one of both splendor and restraint. She walked behind her son in great processions, dressed in rich but modest robes, a symbol of dignity and piety. She insisted on maintaining her chastity within her marriage to Thomas Stanley, living chaste in the body, as though she were a nun. Stanley, ever the pragmatist, accepted this arrangement. He had gained wealth, prestige and safety from their union, and he knew better than to challenge her will. At court, Margaret's apartments were among the most lavish, rivaling even those of Queen Elizabeth of York, Henry's new bride. Yet she never overstepped the Queen. Margaret understood that harmony was essential to Tudor's survival. Elizabeth, daughter of Edward IV, symbolized the Yorkist half of the marriage that had united the Roses. Margaret, Lancastrian to the bone, embodied the other. Together, they formed the living fusion of rival houses, though all knew where the true weight of authority lay. Behind the scenes, Margaret advised her son constantly. Henry VII, cautious and shrewd, shared his mother's sense of discipline and secrecy. He had learned from her example that survival depended on patience, vigilance, and the careful cultivation of loyalty. She was his confidant, his counselor, his moral compass. In financial matters, Margaret's influence was profound. She oversaw estates, guided royal patronage, and ensured her family's wealth grew in security. But her power was not merely financial. It was spiritual, intellectual, and political. Margaret was deeply devout, rising in the early hours for prayer, fasting, and attending daily Massachusetts. Her piety lent her authority in a court still scarred by decades of civil war. To criticize Margaret Beaufort was to criticize a woman widely seen as holy, chosen by God. And she did not waste her sanctity. She used it as armor, the guise of holiness cloaking the mind of a strategist. She became a patron of learning and faith. She founded colleges at Cambridge, Christ's College and St. John's, and supported scholars, ensuring that the Tudor dynasty was associated not only with power but with the flowering of intellect. She translated devotional texts into English, unusual for a woman of her rank, ensuring that the laity could partake in spiritual reading. To many she appeared almost saint-like, her life a balance of charity, learning, and religious zeal. Yet beneath the veil of piety, Margaret remained ever vigilant. The Tudor crown newly won was fragile. Henry VII's reign was beset by threats. Pretenders like Lambert Simnel and Perkin Warbeck, Yorkist plots, and lingering resentment among the nobility. Each time, Margaret's steady hand reinforced the dynasty. She prayed, she advised, she whispered to her son when paranoia threatened to overwhelm him. She reminded him of their long years of exile, of the price paid to claim the crown. She urged him to be ruthless when needed and merciful when prudent. Margaret's relationship with Elizabeth of York was complex. Elizabeth was beautiful, gracious, beloved by many. She gave Henry children, securing the dynasty's future with heirs and daughters who would be married into the courts of Europe. Yet Elizabeth was often overshadowed by her formidable mother-in-law. Margaret managed royal households, arranged ceremonies, and sometimes even dictated matters that traditionally belonged to the queen. It was an unusual dynamic, a queen consort gently eclipsed by the king's mother, but Elizabeth bore it with patience and perhaps relief. For while Elizabeth embodied the Tudor ideal of unity, Margaret bore the burden of guardianship. In the 1490s, as Henry VII consolidated his rule, Margaret's influence grew quieter but deeper. She presided over her household with discipline, commanding loyalty from servants and courtiers alike. She cultivated an image of serene authority, the matriarch of the new order. She was seen as both noble lady and near abbess, half in the world, half in devotion. And yet, despite her outward peace, Margaret never truly relaxed. She had lived through too much loss, too much treachery to ever feel secure. She kept her son close, advising him with the same urgency she had felt when he was a child in exile. She watched over her grandchildren with the same intensity, ensuring the next generation of Tudors would be strong. She had survived girlhood, widowhood, exile, and conspiracy. Now, as Lady the King's mother, Margaret Beaufort stood at the pinnacle of her power. She was the living embodiment of endurance, a woman who had bent the storms of history to her will, who had carried a dynasty on her shoulders. But her story was not yet finished. For even as she basked in the triumph of her son's reign, she knew that life, as it always had for her, could turn in an instant. The dynasty she had fought to establish would be tested again. The Tudors would know both glory and heartbreak. And Margaret Beaufort, ever watchful, would be there to guide them to the end of her days. By the turn of the 16th century, Margaret Beaufort had lived through more upheaval than most could endure. She had seen dynasties fall, kings murdered, and families destroyed. Yet here she stood, 2 decades after Bosworth, not only alive but revered. She was no longer the frightened child bride of legend, nor merely the mother of a king. She was the matriarch of the Tudor dynasty, the silent spine of the realm. Her son Henry VI's reign was never entirely free of peril. Pretenders arose again and again. Lambert Simnel in 1487, who claimed to be the Earl of Warwick, and Perkin Warbeck in the 1490s, who impersonated the lost Prince Richard of York. Each time, Margaret's presence steadied the throne. To her, these threats were simply echoes of the chaos she had endured for decades. She counseled patience, discipline, and vigilance. And in the end, Henry prevailed. Yet even as England stabilized, sorrow touched the royal house. In 1502, tragedy struck. Arthur, Prince of Wales, Henry's eldest son and heir, died suddenly at just 15. The blow shook the kingdom. Arthur's widow, Catherine of Aragon, was left in limbo, her future uncertain. And for Margaret, it was a chilling reminder of how fragile her dynasty still was. The survival of the Tudors now depended on Arthur's younger brother, Henry, Duke of York, a boy destined for greatness, though no one yet knew how great. Elizabeth of York, the gentle queen who had embodied the union of Lancaster and York, died the following year in childbirth. Margaret mourned her daughter-in-law, but in her pragmatic heart, she also recognized a shifting balance. With Elizabeth gone, Margaret's influence became greater still. She was now not only the king's counselor but the most senior female authority at court. As Henry VI's health declined in the early 1500s, Margaret's vigilance deepened. She knew that the stability of everything she had built depended on a smooth succession. She guided her son, ensured that his younger Henry was prepared, and watched over the political alliances that would safeguard the Tudor name. Then in April 1509 the inevitable came. Henry VII, her only child, the boy she had borne in pain at 13, the exile she had nurtured from afar, the king she had helped crown, lay dying. For Margaret, it must have been a moment of profound grief, yet also one of triumph. He had not only lived but reigned for 24 years, founding a dynasty that would outlast them both. When Henry VII passed away, Margaret did not collapse into despair. Instead, she rose with astonishing strength. In those fragile weeks of transition, it was Margaret Beaufort who orchestrated the succession of her grandson. She convened the royal council. She ensured that the machinery of government functioned smoothly. And when the young Henry VIII was crowned, the kingdom looked to his grandmother as the guardian of continuity. For a brief time, Margaret was the most powerful woman in England, perhaps the most powerful person. She governed in her grandson's name until he came of age to take full control. At nearly 70, she stood at the summit of authority, the architect of the dynasty now reigning secure upon the throne. But Margaret's life was drawing to a close. In June 1509, just 2 months after her son's death and only days after witnessing the coronation of her grandson, Margaret Beaufort herself fell ill. She died on June 29, aged about 66. England mourned her as few women had ever been mourned. The Archbishop of Canterbury, William Warham, preached her funeral sermon at Westminster Abbey, calling her a lady both noble and devout, a mother full of wisdom, a counselor to princes, and in every fortune steadfast. She was buried beside her beloved son Henry VII, their tombs side by side in the Lady Chapel of Westminster Abbey, a chapel Henry himself had ordered built, which would soon bear his name. Margaret's legacy was vast. She was remembered as a woman of deep piety, whose prayers shaped the destiny of a kingdom. She was revered as a patron of learning, her foundations at Cambridge ensuring that education and faith flourished under her name. But above all, she was seen as the mother of the Tudor dynasty, the woman who had borne the crown in her womb and carried it through decades of war and peril until it was safely enthroned upon her son's head. Her grandson, Henry VIII, would go on to define an era reshaping church and state, remembered as one of the most powerful and controversial monarchs in history. Her great-granddaughter, Elizabeth I, would rule a golden age. Yet in the shadows of their triumphs stood Margaret Beaufort, the root of their line, the woman whose will had bent history. She had begun life as a fragile girl of 13, forced into marriage and nearly broken by childbirth. She had endured exile, powerlessness, and separation from her son. But she had never faltered, never ceased to believe that her child was destined for greatness. Through cunning, patience, faith, and sheer indomitable will, she had transformed despair into dynasty. And so, when we speak of the Tudors, of Henry VIII's passion, of Elizabeth I's brilliance, we must remember the woman who made them possible. Margaret Beaufort, the mother of the Tudors. The matriarch who turned survival into triumph, and whose quiet strength changed the fate of England forever.